the veins of the Megacity beneath the asphalt and exhaust fumes of modern Rome, a paradox. Today, we view our cities as the pinnacle of human engineering, complex networks of electricity, pressurized water, and automated waste removal. We look back at the ancient world and imagine a primitive existence defined by dirt, disease, and crude survival. But this assumption is fundamentally flawed. If you were transported to Rome at the height of the empire, between 100 and 300 AD, you would not find a primitive settlement. You would find a hyper-engineered megacity of 1 million people. You would be standing inside a massive, living machine. The Romans did not just build temples and arenas. They conquered the elements. They engineered artificial rivers that defied gravity, constructed subterranean labyrinths to flush away the waste of 1 million bodies, and pioneered a system of urban planning that would not be seen again until the 19th century. Today, we are going to dissect this machine. We will pull back the marble facades to expose the concrete, the lead pipes, and the dark sewers that made life in the ancient world's greatest metropolis possible. We will explore how the Roman city actually worked, who maintained its vital organs, and the catastrophic collapse that occurred when the machine finally broke. The master grid and urban layout. To understand Roman infrastructure, we must first understand how they organized space. The city of Rome itself was an anomaly. Because it grew organically over centuries, its street plan was chaotic and labyrinthine. But when the Romans conquered new territories and built cities from scratch, they imposed absolute mathematical order upon the landscape. This model was based on the castrum, the standard Roman military camp. The entire city was laid out on a strict orthogonal grid. The primary north-south axis was called the Cardo Maximus, and the primary east-west axis was the Decumanus Maximus. Where these two massive arteries intersected lay the forum, the political, religious, and economic heart of the city. The rest of the city was divided into neat, rectangular blocks known as insulae. The streets themselves were marvels of engineering. Main thoroughfares were not mere dirt paths. They were heavily paved with silex-hard volcanic basalt. The roads were deliberately crowned, meaning they were slightly higher in the center than on the edges, allowing rainwater and street runoff to drain into the gutters. The Romans also understood the necessity of separating pedestrian traffic from vehicular traffic and waste. Consequently, they built elevated sidewalks, often bordered by stone curbs. At major intersections, large stepping stones were placed across the street. These allowed citizens to cross without stepping into the water and refuse that often flowed through the road, while the gaps between the stones were precisely measured to allow the standardized axles of Roman carts to pass through unimpeded. The vertical city architecture and housing. In a city of 1 million people bounded by geography and defensive walls, you cannot build outward. You must build upward. The iconic image of the Roman domus, the sprawling, single-story house with an open atrium and colonnaded garden, was a luxury reserved strictly for the ultra-wealthy elite. Upwards of 90% of Rome's population lived in insulae, massive, multi-story apartment blocks. The insula is the ancient ancestor of the modern tenement. These structures could reach 6, 7, or even 8 stories high. They were constructed using opus cementitium Roman concrete, made from a revolutionary mixture of volcanic ash pozzolana lime and aggregate faced with fired brick. The social hierarchy of an insula was the exact opposite of a modern high-rise. Today, the wealthy live in the penthouse. In ancient Rome, the wealthy lived on the ground floor, the bottom. Apartments were spacious, possessed running water from the city's aqueducts, and had access to private sanitation. As you climbed higher, the rent decreased, and the living conditions deteriorated rapidly. Top-floor apartments were cramped, single-room dwellings. They had no running water, meaning residents had to carry heavy clay jugs up 6 flights of stairs daily. They had no glass in the windows, only wooden shutters, meaning in winter, residents had to choose between freezing in the dark or suffocating in the smoke of a charcoal brazier. Because of the heavy reliance on open flames for cooking, heating, and lighting, fire was the ultimate terror of the Roman urbanite. Entire blocks could burn to the ground in hours. To combat this, The Emperor Augustus established the Vigiles Urbani in 6 AD. This was a paramilitary force of 7,000 freedmen who served as the city's fire brigade and night watch. Armed with axes, buckets, and massive water pump siphones, their primary tactic was often to demolish surrounding buildings to create fire breaks. Despite their efforts, building collapses and infernos were a grim, daily reality for the urban poor. The veins of the empire, water and aqueducts. If concrete was the bone of Rome, water was its blood. The scale of Roman water consumption is staggering. By the 3rd century AD, Rome was supplied by 11 major aqueducts, delivering an estimated 200 to 300 million gallons of fresh water into the city every single day. This provided a per capita water usage roughly equivalent to, or even exceeding, modern New York City. The engineering behind the aqueducts relied on a single, fundamental force: gravity. Romans did not have motorized pumps to push water over mountains. Instead, engineers used surveying instruments like the chorobates to calculate a continuous, microscopic downward gradient from a mountain spring dozens of miles away, all the way to the city center. The famous stone arches we see today were only used when the aqueduct had to cross a valley. For over 80% of their length, aqueducts ran underground in buried stone channels to protect the water from evaporation and enemy sabotage. When the water reached the city, it did not flow directly into homes. It first entered a castellum aquae, massive distribution tank. Here, the water was allowed to settle, dropping its sediment. From the castellum, the water was divided into 3 main channels, prioritizing distribution in a very specific order. The first priority was the public fountains lacus. There were hundreds of these scattered across every neighborhood in Rome, ensuring that no citizen was ever more than a 50-meter walk from fresh, continuously flowing water. The second priority was the public baths thermae, the massive, palatial leisure complexes that were central to Roman culture and hygiene. Only the third and final division of water was allocated to private, paying customers, the wealthy elites who had legally tapped into the city's mains using stamped lead pipes called fistula. Flushing the Megacity waste and sewers, what comes in must go out. Delivering hundreds of millions of gallons of water into a densely packed valley requires an equally massive system to remove it. This brings us to the subterranean shadow of Roman engineering, the sewer system, anchored by the legendary Cloaca Maxima, the Great Drain. Originally constructed in the 6th century BC as an open-air canal to drain the marshy land that would become the Roman Forum, by the imperial era, the Cloaca Maxima was fully enclosed in stone and vaulted with concrete. It was a massive underground river that flushed the runoff of the city directly into the Tiber River. The Romans even deified this infrastructure, worshipping Cloacina, the goddess of the sewer, ensuring spiritual protection over the city's hygiene. But we must discard the modern myth that Roman sanitation was perfectly sanitary. While the engineering was brilliant, its application was deeply flawed by modern standards. Public latrines were widespread and featured continuously flowing water to carry waste into the sewers. However, very few private residences, even the homes of the wealthy, were directly connected to the main sewer lines. Why? Because the Roman sewers had no traps. A direct connection to the Cloaca Maxima meant that toxic, explosive methane gas, the horrific stench of the city's waste, and vermin could crawl straight up the pipes and into your home. Furthermore, heavy rains could cause the Tiber River to back up, flooding the sewers and blasting raw sewage back up into connected houses. Therefore, most citizens living in the insulae relied on chamber pots. These were either carried down to a communal cesspit beneath the stairs, sold to fullers who used the ammonia in human urine to bleach and clean woolen togas, or, illegally, dumped directly out of upper-story windows into the streets below. Roman law explicitly included provisions for citizens to sue for damages if they were struck by human waste thrown from a building. The streets of Rome, despite the constant overflow of clean water from the fountains, were a filthy, hazardous environment. The human engine population and occupations infrastructure does not maintain itself. The Roman grid was sustained by a massive, invisible army of labor. The maintenance of the aqueducts and sewers fell under the jurisdiction of high-ranking magistrates, most famously the Curator Aquarum Commissioner of Waters. In the late 1st century AD, this post was held by Sextus Julius Frontinus, who wrote a surviving, meticulously detailed manual on the city's water system. But the physical labor was executed by the familia publica, the public slaves owned by the state. Frontinus commanded a specialized force of hundreds of slaves. There were the vilici overseers, the castellari who managed the distribution tanks, the silicari who ripped up the basalt paving stones to access pipes, and the aquari, the plumbers who fabricated and welded the lead fistula. Waste management also required an immense workforce. The stercorarii were manure collectors. They moved through the city with carts, emptying the cesspits of the insulae and collecting animal waste from the streets. This was not merely garbage disposal, it was an economic necessity. The collected waste was carted outside the city walls and sold as vital fertilizer to the massive agricultural estates that surrounded Rome. In the Roman urban economy, absolutely nothing was wasted. The economics of infrastructure, trade, and power. Infrastructure was not just a matter of public health. It was the mechanism of imperial survival. A city of 1 million people cannot feed itself. Rome was a parasitic entity, reliant on a massive logistical network spanning the Mediterranean. This network converged at Ostia, Rome's port city at the mouth of the Tiber. Here, massive fleets from Egypt and North Africa arrived carrying hundreds of thousands of tons of grain. Because the heavy seafaring ships could not navigate the shallow, winding Tiber up to Rome, the cargo was transferred into smaller river barges, naves caudicariae. These barges were then physically dragged up the river to the city by teams of oxen or human laborers pulling on tow ropes from the riverbanks. This entire logistical chain existed primarily to serve the annona, the state-sponsored grain dole. Up to 200,000 adult male citizens of Rome were entitled to receive a free monthly ration of grain, subsidized by the emperor. In the Roman world, infrastructure was the ultimate political propaganda. Emperors did not stay in power merely through military might. They maintained order through euergetism, the practice of doing good deeds for the public. When Emperor Trajan built a massive new bath complex, or when Claudius completed a new aqueduct, they were not just providing water, they were physically stamping their authority onto the landscape. By providing the water, the roads, and the grain, the emperor positioned himself as the father of the city. To control the infrastructure was to control the mob. When the water stopped decline and defense for over 3 centuries, the machine ran flawlessly. But infrastructure is fragile. It requires a massive centralized authority, infinite wealth, and thousands of skilled laborers to maintain it. When the political stability of the Roman Empire began to fracture, the urban grid was the first casualty. In the late 3rd century, recognizing that the Pax Romana was dead, Emperor Aurelian ordered the construction of a massive defensive wall, entirely enclosing the city. It was an admission of vulnerability. Rome was no longer an untouchable capital, it was a fortress. The fatal blow to the ancient metropolis did not come from a single battle, but from a calculated act of infrastructural murder. In the year 537 AD, during the Gothic War, an army of Ostrogoths under King Vitiges laid siege to Rome. Knowing they could not breach the massive Aurelian walls, Vitiges targeted the city's lifeblood. His troops systematically smashed and severed the aqueducts outside the city. For the first time in centuries, the water stopped. The immediate effect was catastrophic. The great public baths, capable of holding thousands of people, were instantly rendered useless, transforming into dry, echoing caverns of useless marble. The public fountains ran dry. The great watermills on the Janiculum Hill, which ground the grain for the city's bread, stopped turning. Without the aqueducts, the high ground of the city became uninhabitable. The population, already severely diminished by war and plague, abandoned the hills and retreated to the low-lying campus marshes, forcing themselves to drink directly from the polluted Tiber River. The maintenance crews were gone. The Cloaca Maxima choked with silt and debris, causing the Roman Forum to flood and slowly return to the swamp it had been 1,000 years prior. The massive insulae, devoid of inhabitants and upkeep, succumbed to rot, fire, and gravity, collapsing into the streets. The population plummeted from 1 million to barely 30,000. The grand, mathematical grid of the Roman capital was buried under centuries of dirt, replaced by the chaotic, winding dirt paths of the Middle Ages. The machine had died. The illusion of permanence. Today, modern Rome sits directly on top of the ancient machine. When subway engineers dig new tunnels, they constantly strike the buried aqueducts, the crushed insulae, and the hardened concrete of the empire. It is easy to look at the ruins of Rome and see only a dead civilization. But the true legacy of the Roman city is not in the broken marble or the empty temples. It is in the very concept of the urban grid. The Romans proved that human beings could master their environment, that water could be bent to our will, and that 1 million people could live together in an artificial landscape of our own making. But Rome also leaves us with a profound and unsettling warning. Infrastructure is not permanent. It is a fragile contract between the present and the future. The moment we stop maintaining the sewers, the roads, and the water, the machine stops. And as the citizens of Rome learned when the aqueducts ran dry in 537 AD, the distance between a hyper-advanced megacity and an uninhabitable ruin is simply a matter of maintenance.